Good afternoon, amazing people. Welcome back. And we are almost finishing the amazing day with DevOps Pro conference, the first day. And I will see you tomorrow. But today I am presenting to you Ricardo Castro. Hi, Ricardo. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good. How about yourself?
Oh, I'm amazing. It is so interesting here. And I have LinkedIn, peeping with all the invites. And I really like this, people communicating and connecting. It's awesome.
Great. It's awesome. Really excited to be here.
Oh, I'm very happy. When I look at your resume, it's a principal SRE engineer.
Yeah, that's it.
I like when you say principal. It always makes me think about the school straight away.
It's kind of the same way. I'm joking a little bit, but yeah, it's a little bit more of a senior role, kind of at the director level, but for in an individual contributor capacity. It just means that my responsibility is that for an entire cluster of teams, and specifically for the SRE area within Fanduel.
Amazing experience. We have a lot to learn from you. And I've seen that you are working with the community as well a lot.
Yeah. Yes, I do.
So
So I
thank you
yeah,
for
yeah.
that. It's very important.
Yeah. So I organize a DevOps Portal meetup, which we have a session at least once a month, and I also co-organize the DevOps Days Portugal conference.
So actually, now I'm asking everyone when you go on vacation to Portugal to contact Ricardo and go for a vacation and go for DevOps Meet to
Yeah,
Portugal. How cool is that?
yeah, that'd be nice. That'd be awesome. So we have at least once a month. So it could be the case that when you're around, we just have a session. So feel free to jump in. It's free. So just jump in, participate.
It's cool. And yeah, guys, if you want to present, now we have a contact person to be a
Yeah,
star in
absolutely,
Portugal. And
absolutely.
you actually live at the vacation destination, so it's
Yeah,
just.
we just
And
need to take advantage of that.
another thing I really loved about your presentation on the website that you're doing martial arts. So I saw that you
Yeah.
are Indiana Jones in the IT world.
No, I still do Taekwondo, but I'm now thinking about trying something different, just something completely different. I don't know, so maybe Jiu-Jitsu or Judo, just to have a different experience. But yeah, I really enjoyed. I started martial arts late in my not like like a youth person, but I really enjoyed it, and I've been practicing for more than 10 years now.
Wow, amazing. Thank you very much for breaking the kind of stereotype of IT guys being nerdy and, just at the computer 24/7. Like IT is totally different world nowadays. So
Absolutely, completely different. So, and we benefited a lot from having just more people getting into and having different experiences and different interests. So it's very, very good for the industry as a whole.
I totally agree. So Ricardo, SRE, anti-pattern roadblocks, rebranding the operation team. The floor is yours. I will listen very carefully.
Thank you very much. So let me start by thanking the organization for accepting my talk, and thank you all of you who are attending the talk. So today I'm going to talk about SRE in general, but I'm going to talk about the fact that whenever we try to employ a new practice or onboard a new practice within our organizations, we can fall ourselves into some kind of anti-patterns. The one that I'm going to specifically talk about is when we try to onboard or try to implement SRE, we can fall into an anti-pattern that I usually call the rebranding the operations team. And in a few slides, you guys are going to see what I mean about this. So what do we have on the menu for today? So we're going to talk about SRE. So we're going to do a brief introduction of what SRE is and how it came about, and what is the state of SRE today. We will then quickly do an overview of what an anti-pattern can be, and then we're going to delve right into the rebranding the operations team, and we're going to talk about the anti-pattern itself, and more important, we're going to talk about some strategies that we can employ to either fix or avoid the pattern altogether. And before I leave you, I'm going to briefly describe some more SRE's anti-pattern that I've found along my career. I'm going to talk about this anti-pattern specifically, and then describe a few more. And those are all anti-patterns that I faced myself. So I have first-hand experience because I had these struggles myself. So I'm going to talk about the struggles that I went to and how some of the things that I tried to do to avoid them. So why SRE? So it seems, if we now that we are in the industry, that something happened somewhere along the way, and now SRE is everywhere. It's like we had like a big bang event, something, an explosion kind of happened, and now everyone's talking about SRE. Every company wants to onboard SRE. Every company has SRE positions open. Every company has an SRE team. So, but this was not the case, right? So there was some kind of evolution that brought SRE into the table, or a practice that was called SRE to try to solve some problem. So if we go back a little bit into the 80s, we can see that the 80s marks a very important decade for what we today know as the internet. So in 1983 marks, many people attribute as the birth of the internet, because it was the year when TCP/IP was born. And that meant that we had a standardized way to have computer networks talking to each other. Later in that decade, in 1989, Tim Berners-Lee developed what we today know, www. That meant that 1 year later, he developed the first client-server application. And those developments during the 80s and the democratization of the internet and the internet arriving at people's houses meant that more and more people were getting into the internet. That also meant that companies starting to look at the internet as a new avenue to expand. So a lot of companies, in fact, were born during the 90s, and some of them are still around today, and some of them you might know them. So, some small companies like Google or Amazon were born during the 90s, and those meant that those companies start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. By bigger, it means both in terms of people, but also in terms of the types of service and the services themselves that they provide. So around the turn of the century, we had what is known as the dot-com boom, which meant that there was a lot of excitement on the internet, and like every hype, there's a crash. So a lot of companies didn't actually offer a lot of value, but one of the results of the dot-com boom was that some of those companies actually succeeded and kept getting bigger. Again, we'll go back to the ones that we know today, like the Amazons and the Googles of today. So those companies started getting so big that they started having some troubles with actually developing and managing their services at scale. So this meant that software and system architecture started to get more and more complex. Also, scale increased considerably. So organizations started to having systems bigger and bigger and bigger, and even more than that, started to having more and more users on their platforms, which meant that they had to scale the size of their services and infrastructure to sizes that were never seen before. So what this actually meant was that the traditional way that software was developed and run started to fail. So we started to have those problems that we know, that ops versus dev, those started to fail. And of course, we also had non-scalable engineering solutions. So solutions that we adopted in the past didn't actually scale. So this meant that Google, being one of the companies that were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, tried to find out a different way. So Benjamin Trainer-Sloss in 2003 was tasked with building a new type of operations team. So he asked the question, what happens if I get a group of software engineers and put them in charge of operations? And this was the whole idea of SRE. How, if we adopt a software engineering mindset into the operations world, what can happen? So we might think it was a little bit precocious during 2003, but let's keep in mind that Google was already facing some problems that we only started to face like a decade or more than that afterwards. And a lot of the things that we now know as commonplace and things like cloud native and containers and APIs, Google started to develop those capabilities back then. So they said, oh, what will happen if we adopt a different mindset into running operations instead of this ops versus devs? So a few of the engineering of the site reliability engineering principles. So embracing risk. So SREs assume that risk is there. They assume that hope is not a strategy and that failure will come. So they need to develop systems that are prepared to deal with failure, and they embrace that risk by building systems that can deal with those things. They also understand that reliability needs to be defined, measured, and assessed, and it's not something very vague that we talk about. Our systems need to be reliable. So SRE developed a framework called the Service Level Objectives Framework, where we can do exactly that. We can actually define, measure, and assess if our systems are being or not reliable in the eyes of our users. Also very important, SREs work a lot to eliminate toil. Toil are tasks that need to be done but don't offer any enduring value. So a good example of that is manual deployments. They need to be done, but if I do them today manually, I have to do them tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. So through automation, I can actually eliminate this toil because I can, for example, automate how deployment is done, and that means that I can focus on another task that needs to be dealt with. Of course, SREs are also very interested in monitoring. So they actually, to make a system reliable, they need to understand what's happening with the system. They need to understand how the system is evolving, and they need to understand at scale what is happening with the system underneath. Coupled with that, of course, release engineering. So one of the riskiest things that we can do to a system is to release software, because new software introduces bugs. The mere process of releasing software means that we're going to do something that it's like an external event to the system, and it's not a day-to-day basis where a user is interacting with the system. So release engineering is very important for an SRE, because SREs need to automate, not only automate, but make that release engineering process very, very efficient, and also deal with change. If something goes wrong, they need to have a way to mitigate that. And of course, SRE always strives for simplicity. So a simple solution is always better than a convoluted one. So SREs try to strive for simplicity. So where are we today? So why do we think that SRE, or many people think that SRE came out of nowhere? And it's mostly because in 2016, Google released the Site Reliability Engineering book. And it was good and not so good at the same time for some people. So it was good because Google is one of the most successful engineering organizations in the world. So that meant that everyone could have a glimpse of how Google does operations and a little bit underneath the covers, and understand what they're doing, how they do it. So it was excellent on that part. But if you read that book in 2016, like me, you see that there are 33 chapters. So there's a lot of information. The book is quite big. And that meant that some people started to had some trouble at the time just understanding the whole, everything around that book, and even adapting what was said in that book to their reality, because Google has challenges that a few companies in the world have. So only a handful of companies have some of those challenges. So it was sometimes hard to actually onboard and even in a practical way to do that on our organizations. It's quite funny that we think that SRE came after DevOps. It's actually the other way around. So DevOps was a community effort, while SRE was born within a company and then shared with the whole world. But the term DevOps was coined in 2009, and actually SRE inside Google had its birth way before. We can, if we search the internet, we can see there are a few talks and some discussion about SRE even before this book came out. But it's this book that actually promotes and starts to sell the SRE term into the world. After that, Google released 2 more books that are also very good books, and I highly recommend. The one in the middle is the Site Reliability Workbook, and it actually provides more day-to-day tips on how to onboard some of the SRE practice. And the last book that Google released was the Build Secure and Reliable Systems. Actually gives practical tips on how to build systems from the ground up to be secure and reliable. So if we're trying to onboard SRE or trying to implement SRE practice, like with any other practice, we can fall into something that we can call an anti-pattern. So what is an anti-pattern? Let's get this out of the way. So learning from Andrew Koenig, we can see that an anti-pattern is just like a pattern, except that instead of a solution, it gives something that looks superficially like one, but isn't one. Okay, this might give us an idea, but I like Martin Fowler's definition much better. So an anti-pattern is a solution that initially looks like an attractive low road lined with flowers, but further down it leads into a maze filled with monsters. So the idea here is that no one sets out to do something bad out of the get-go, right? So everyone has good intentions. The problem with the anti-patterns is that it's something that initially looks like something that it's good, but we end up finding out that it actually isn't good. Also, very important is that sometimes the patterns of today can turn themselves into the anti-patterns of tomorrow. And we're going to see an example next. So probably you are all familiar with this keyboard, right? We know that this to be the QWERTY keyboard. But does anyone know where this keyboard comes from? If you try to guess and guess the typewriter, you guess right. So today we're using this keyboard because many, many years ago, we started typing in QWERTY keyboards. But why this layout? This is the key here. Why do we have the QWERTY layout and not another layout specifically for typewriters? And it's mostly due to two reasons. So the first one is that when you type in a typewriter, there are needles that hit the sheet of paper. And depending on the distribution of the keys and the needles on the typewriter, it means that those needles could hit each other. So the layout was developed so that we could minimize the amount of hitting that those needles did to one another. Also, we also wanted to optimize to a keyboard that would allow people to type with one hand while doing something with another hand. This meant that we actually were slowing people down for some kind of efficiency. Now, in the digital world, in the keyboard that we're using today, we don't have the need for that, right? So we don't have needles hitting each other. So they're actually, the pattern that was developed back in the day, and it for good reason, actually transformed into some kind of anti-pattern today. Actually, we already know that we have keyboards that would allow humans to type faster, and some people are already doing it. But because we are so accustomed to it, we are so used to using the QWERTY keyboard, we are still using it, although we do have better options. So this is just an example of something that back in the day was actually a pattern. We actually developed something with the actual goal of slowing humans down for purposes of being more efficient of typing that today are actually an anti-pattern and are slowing us down. So, and this leads us to our anti-pattern of today. And the anti-pattern as a whole is very simple. So in it, it's this concept of we rebrand whatever we call our operations team today into something else, in this case, SRE. So if you worked in the industry 10, 15, 20 years ago, you probably had ops and ops people within the organization, which back in the day, we usually call them sysadmins. That doesn't mean they don't exist today. It just means that probably they were rebranded to something else. Eventually, down the road, some people started having production engineers. Other organizations started having DevOps engineers. And now there's this whole movement around SRE. And the anti-pattern is this idea that we turn our ops team into and call them SREs, but little else changes. Maybe some tool here and there, but in essence, their day-to-day tasks still the same. The tooling is mostly the same, and even the way that they deal with things is exactly the same or very similar to what they're used to doing. I usually generalize this rebranding X to Y because this happens a lot across the industry. We've seen that with Agile, where organizations said, oh, we are an Agile organization because now we have standards, but everything else stayed the same. So in practice, they were not Agile. They just adopted a new name and probably changed something, tweaked here and there. Another example is CI/CD, where a lot of organizations probably automated something, but they didn't actually have full CI/CD with quick feedback and iterations. So we can generalize this to a lot of practice. But what we're focusing here today is this idea that we have some kind of an ops team that is responsible for ops work. All of a sudden, we call them SREs, and off we go. They are now SREs. The problem with that is that nothing else changes. So down the line, engineers will start getting tired. It will probably good in the beginning, for example, for hiring. Now the SRE title is very hot on the market. So, and a lot of organizations are taking advantage of this. But down the line, it gets into trouble. So how can we fix this? So the first thing that we can do is educate ourselves. Okay. So around the term SRE, what does SRE really mean? So here are just an example of the books that I showed before, but there's a lot more that we can do. We can go to conferences like the one that we are today. We can go to meetups. We can talk with colleagues in other organizations. So the idea here is to understand what SRE is, to talk with people and go to events to understand how are some organizations implementing SRE, what works for them, what didn't work. And it's this whole idea of, okay, before I try to apply whatever it is to my organization, it's probably a good idea if I inform myself a little bit more and gain more knowledge, and then try to adapt what others have taught me and what I've read on a website or on a book, and see how that translates into my organization. Very important, and this applies to any kind of rebranding XY, is to just start with why. Why do you want to onboard SRE? What's your goal? What are you trying to solve? What are you trying to improve? It's a lot better if you understand why you are doing something than going straight directly to the what. So if we go, the examples of going straight to the what is, okay, I'm going to adopt this new technology. Okay, why are we adopting this new technology? Or we're going to start doing this kind of practice. Why are we doing this kind of practice? If we start with the why and we understand why something is done, it will be a lot easier for us to first to understand if this really applies to me or not. It will be a lot easier to make the adaptations that we need, and then we can go to the what and say, okay, if I want to, for example, to learn more from my incidents, I can start employing postmortems. If I just start doing postmortems for the sake of it, it will start to be something that some people just find cumbersome. They don't really follow the process. They don't really learn. But yeah, we're doing postmortems. But that's the what. The why we are doing postmortems is because failure will happen, and we want to avoid them as much as possible, and we want to learn from them. And this is just an example. Another thing, if you read the book and you see the myriad of things that are in the SRE book, you might get into trouble in just trying to discern what you should be focusing on. So the Pareto principle just says that usually 80% of the results come from 20% of the efforts. So this is two things. So this we can apply this in two ways. First and foremost, if we start with the why, just see why are we trying to onboard SRE or trying to adapt or trying to put SRE practice in the organization. So trying to identify which are the areas and which are the things that we are trying to solve, and then putting effort into those. And the other part is, of course, just looking at the SRE myriad of things that we can employ and trying to understand in that sense, okay, what can I easily translate into my organization, or what can I onboard to my organization that will give me the most bang for the buck. That means that we're going to here make some decisions in terms of what are the things that we're going to onboard. For example, if we really want to understand how reliable we are from the eyes of our users, we should start to develop SLOs. This means that we're still going to start refocusing reliability into the eyes of our users, and then measuring and finding the metrics, the SLIs and the SLOs that will actually tell us, are we being reliable or not? Another good approach to actually try to onboard some practices into our organization, SRE practices, is to use the Eisenhower matrix. So the Eisenhower matrix allows us to divide and to categorize what we need to do into 4 categories. So if something is not important and not urgent, just leave it. So if it comes up again, it probably is not important, not urgent. It needs to be done. But if you consider that something is not important, not urgent, just delete it. If something is not important, but it is urgent, it's something that you can delegate. Conversely, if something is important and urgent, you just need to do it, right? So if you're doing things like manual changes, manual deployments, you just need to do it. Where you can gain some time is the stuff that is important and not urgent. And these are the things where it's something that really needs to be done, but you don't have it to do it right now. More often than not, these are what we call project works and what SRE is called project work. So it's something that needs to be done, something like related to evolving our platform, automating this, or automating something in our infrastructure. And those are the things that, if done, they won't transform themselves into important and urgent, because this is the risk. Stuff that is important and not urgent will eventually turn into important and urgent. So if we can find the time to do project work around important and not urgent, it's very good, because we can actually gain some time and evolve. And if you still have no idea where to start, investing in observability is always a good option. So observability is a characteristic of a system to be understood by its external outputs. When we start talking about observability, a lot of people go straight into the three pillars of observability, but that again is like what we've seen with the start with the why. That's the what, right? So why do we want to invest in observability? So as SREs, we want to understand whatever state our systems got themselves into. So we want to understand what happened to our system. I did this deploy. What happened? Did things get better? Did things get worse? Even if I don't do anything, for example, are my systems getting slower with time? So observability will be whatever you find necessary to understand in what state did your systems got themselves into, and just by looking at their external outputs. The three pillars of observability, commonly known as the logs, metrics, and traces, are a good starting point. But depending on your context, you might need different things like stack traces, things like continuous profiling. It will be heavily and highly dependent on your context, so you will need to adapt. But investing in observability is critical for SRE, and it's always a good option, even if you don't still trying to figure out what should be your next step in terms of onboarding SRE. So the SRE anti-pattern that I just spoke about is just one of many examples. So this is the one that I think can turn themselves into the others and the other SRE patterns. But I'm going to quickly describe some of the other anti-patterns here on this list. So the first one is the one that we've just seen. So it's this rebranding the operations team. So we have a team that somehow is responsible for ops, whatever ops means within our organization, and we just rebranded into SRE. But their day-to-day work and the tools that they use and the practice that they use mostly stays the same. The other one that I usually call lack of observability is this effort that SREs put themselves into trying to understand and trying to make changes into a system without having the adequate observability. This means that they have a hard time understanding what's happening with their systems. When they do a change, they have a hard time understanding did things get better, did things got worse, did it still the same. They have a hard time understanding how is the system evolving, is it getting slower, is it getting faster. So without observability, SREs also have a very hard time to understand what's happening with our systems and even understanding if the users are happy or not. Another anti-pattern is not assessing user satisfaction. So one of the best approaches to define and measure reliability is to somehow find a framework. The SLO framework is a good example of defining reliability from the eyes of our users. So it's not me, an engineer, or someone from any other team that defines reliability. So we need to go to the customer, to our users, and say, what do we really value on our platform? Then having the observability necessary to understand, to measure what the user said, and then we can prioritize work in terms of is the user happy or not, or do we have some leeway to do some experiments, to do more deployments, to do more risky things. Another common anti-pattern is poor incident management. So it's this practice of where we have incidents, we handle them badly, and we don't learn anything from them. It's a common anti-pattern where incidents are not seen as a valuable learning experience, and we get into that habit of we have an incident, we mitigate it or we solve it, and we forget about it. And more often than not, an incident or something very similar happens again. Another common anti-pattern is the SRE hero. So it's the idea that the SREs are always there to save the day. And so people think that they are some kind of a hero because they fix all the things. They are the ones that show up at the end of the day and fix everything. And it's not the case. So reliability is not a concern of an entire team, just like security and quality and every other practice. SRE should be a practice within an organization. We can have enablement teams and SRE teams to help us out, but SRE is a responsibility of the entire organization. So if we have an SRE hero, we're not in a good path to onboard SRE practice. Another one, and this is an obvious one, is having poor automation. So SRE needs time for project work. So if they don't invest sufficiently in automation and in project work, this means that they will be jumping from fire to fire. And the next fire will always be the most important thing. So this is the idea that SRE needs to employ those software engineering practices to solving operations work instead of just doing manual things over and over again. And there are a lot more. These are just a few examples of some anti-patterns that we can get ourselves into. So, quick summary. What do we talked about today? So we talked about what is SRE. We talked about the why of SRE, and in a sentence or two is this idea that with time systems started getting more and more complex, bigger and bigger in terms both in terms of users using our systems, then that's the scale of the systems that need to support all those users, and eventually organizations started to have some trouble into how do we do this? How do we operate these systems at scale? So Google in 2003 started to find a solution to this problem and develop what they now call SRE. And it's this idea of applying software engineering practices to the process of managing operations. So whenever we try to onboard any new practice into our organizations, we can fall into anti-patterns, which is this idea of something that we start to do with the best of our intentions, but then along the way we can actually find out they're not a good thing. We saw the example of the keyboard, where the QWERTY keyboard back in the day was something that was developed with a very good intention, but that nowadays it actually is an anti-pattern. And then we saw how we can fix this anti-pattern. So the anti-pattern of the rebranding, the operations team, is the idea that we do have some sort of an operations team. They do things a certain way, they use certain tools, and then from one day to the other, we just call them SRE, but little else changes. Means that they will probably keep working the same way, they will be facing the same challenges, they will be tackling things the same way, they will be using the same tools, using the same approaches, and that actually is just a rebranding. So nothing really changed, we just gave them another name. So I saw a few ideas on how to change that. So we saw that we need to educate ourselves, understand what's being done in the industry, what others are doing, what worked, what didn't. We saw that we need to start with some kind of a why. Why are we trying to onboard SRE? Why are we trying to put SRE within our organization? And then we can talk about the tools and the practice, but first understand what are we trying to solve or what are we trying to improve. Then we saw two ways that we can prioritize work, both with the Pareto principle and then the Eisenhower matrix. And those two practices can also give us an idea of the myriad of things that SRE can offer us. So what are some of the things that are actually contextual within our organization? And last but not least, if we don't have any idea where to start, where should we start, we can invest in observability. And it's this idea that we're going to equip our systems with data that will allow us engineers to understand what's happening underneath the covers. And at the end, I just gave a brief overview of some of other anti-patterns that a lot of them come out of just rebranding the operations team, and they are a consequence of that. And this was all from my part. I hope this was an interesting talk to you. Feel free to ask questions. And if afterwards and after the conference, you want to continue this conversation, feel free to connect with me in both Twitter or on LinkedIn, or just visit my website. So thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed my talk.
Thank you, Ricardo. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for all the energy. How do you feel now?
I'm good, actually, very good. So this is something that, and now on my day-to-day basis, is something that I'm trying to do once again. So onboarding SRE into an organization, a big organization. So it's easy to fall into this and other anti-patterns. So I've seen some of these before, so I'm trying not to fall into them again.
Thank you. We have a question in the audience. So what are the main difference between SRE and DevOps, and how do they complement each other inside the team?
Sure. So one of firstly the main difference or in their genesis was that SRE was born inside an organization that had clear goals and say this is what we want to solve, and DevOps started more like something that the industry was starting to face. So the problem was similar, but they started to face the two approaches. So and the industry as a whole had this idea of, okay, so we have these ops here, we have these devs here, they don't talk to each other, they throw things over a wall, the proverbial wall, and we need to fix this. So in practice, they were trying to tackle the same problem. What happened was because DevOps is not very prescriptive, it just said, okay, we need to get these groups of people together. DevOps started to delve more into how do we accelerate deployments and mostly feedback loops. How can we get software faster in front of people, learning from that and iterating quickly. So today we see a lot of DevOps associated, for example, with CI/CD, some basic infrastructure, deployments, all that kind of thing. I think that both practices eventually meet in the middle. So while DevOps in most organizations starts with, okay, how can we iterate quickly in this feedback loop and getting software out the door quickly, that usually SRE starts the other way around, starts with production, looking at production and see what's happening or not. And then it goes a little bit backwards. So now that for example, I invest a lot in observability. Okay, so now I understand that, for example, my deployments are a problem because, I don't know, I have this thing that needs to be done manually, or they fail. So eventually they will touch CI/CD. And the same thing happens the other way around. So you go into CI/CD and then you say, okay, do I do the deployment and I have no idea what happened to a system, or I don't have a good idea if I broke something or not. So I need to invest in observability. So somewhere they will meet in the middle. I just think that they start at different points and they will eventually meet in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you for a very simple answer so everyone can understand that.
Thank you.
That we had a comment in the chat that the only thing more annoying than a colleague typing on a mechanical keyboard would be somebody typing on a typewriter.
Yeah. We have a lot of people using mechanical keyboards nowadays. So I use for headphones with noise canceling. So whenever I work from home, most of the time, whenever I'm at the office, I always use these phones. So I don't suffer moments of that, but in impromptu conversations or informal meetings, that's actually very distracting. So just having someone like tapping, it's like a modern keyboard, modern typewriter, right? It does a lot of noise.
It does. And actually, thank you. I really never thought that the keyboard comes from the typewriter. I was like,
yeah,
it's so obvious. I never thought about that.
Yeah. I knew that, but I didn't know the why, and it was interesting to learn about that. So why do we use like the quality? It had to be a reason. We didn't assign stuff randomly, right? That must have been a reason. It was really interesting to learn a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, thank you bringing that to my attention. And yeah, I really loved your topic and this rebranding thing. It is very annoying as well when kind of managers do that. They kind of do stuff for doing, and then the team sit there and like, but like nothing changed. We did so much work, so much documentation, and like we're doing the same stuff.
Yeah, I think the SRE job title and teams are now being a little bit exploited. Some organizations are using that a lot for recruitment. So they have some form of operations team, be it DevOps teams or whatever. And they're like, okay, so now it's kind of hard to hire sysadmins. What if we call them SREs? It's like sexier. So I see a lot of that. And then people are like, yeah, but everything is the same, is exactly the same or very similar to what it was. So why are we now called SRE? And of course, many organizations are actually trying to solve some problems. So their systems are not reliable, or they want to make them more reliable for whatever purpose, to make users happier, or because they have compliance requirements that they need to adhere to. But yeah, it's very, very annoying when we just rebrand something and then people in the organization are like, yeah, but we're now agile, but we're not really agile. We're doing CI/CD, but we're not really doing CI/CD, right? And it happens a lot.
Yeah, and with agile, it's like, is it, or is it a waterfall in the end?
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of organizations, they take a few bits and pieces from Scrum or from Kanban or something like that. But then if you look, when we really look at it, yeah, this is kind of waterfall, but just disguised with, I don't know, maybe we're doing stand-ups, but everything else keeps the same.
Yeah, it's a fancy waterfall with standards.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's good to laugh about that, but when you actually come to that situation, it's not very pleasantly.
Yeah.
And this platform engineering, a lot of people like saying DevOps is dead. Now it's platform.
Yeah.
And I've seen actually the advertising now, like looking for platform engineer. And I think all DevOps are just sitting there like, okay.
Yep. So I do. So the platform movement is just another one on top of it. I still make some distinction between DevOps / SRE and platform engineering, because for platform engineering we have a lot of literature just talking about how to build platforms. And if anyone who's listening at this talk has ever worked in a big company, they know that for the last 20 or 30 years, big companies have platforms because they need standardization and they need a way to facilitate engineers to do things. So it's like we're just trying to sell this new thing, which is platform engineering, and we've been doing this for a very long time. So nothing really changes. It's just so I do think is that platforms, or if you want to call it platform engineer, that's fine with me. It's just another way that we can actually promote a DevOps culture or even an SRE culture. It's just another way, but it won't work in all companies. So it's not the new thing. It's just one approach that we can use to actually fix our problems.
So, no more questions. Everything is clear. It's been a very interesting day. And thank you very much for this talk, for the energy that you brought us from Portugal. I can feel the sunny energy in your movement.
Yeah, so we're starting to have we're in spring in Portugal, so we're starting to have better weather. So it's sunny today, so it's awesome. So I'm really happy with this with the weather today here in Portugal, in Porto specifically. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Enjoy your rest of the day and see you at the next meetups.
See you. Bye-bye.
This is all we got. Remember the revolution in our minds. This is all we got.
Lock me out of this life institution. I am angry and high on illusions. Yes, I hate, but it's not a solution. Try my best, but I'm just a human. Oh, we don't